I'm Jonathan Brent, Executive Director of the YIVO Institute. And it's a great pleasure to welcome our distinguished panel here this evening, to welcome all of you here this evening, and to discuss a book which I had the privilege of being at the institution that published it at the time it was signed up. So I'm very pleased that a circle has been closed. And some of you, I think, may not be so familiar with the YIVO Institute. We are the largest, most active institute, actually, in the world devoted to the subject of East European Jewish culture in all of its forms: music, art, history, literature, religion, and so forth. We have an archive of some 25 million documents and artifacts. I recently learned, some of you may know, the movie by Werner Herzog, Invincible, about Zisha Breitbart, the Jewish strongman, and we just recently discovered that we have the bar of metal that he twisted into a pretzel in our archive. We also have the diaries of Theodor Herzl. We also have a tremendous collection on the liquor trade. We also have work by a 15th century disciple of Rashi. We also have endless and boundless amounts of material on the shtetl, on all phases of Jewish life in Eastern Europe, in Russia, on the Russian Revolution, on the Bund. And these archives and these resources that we have are being utilized by scholars around the world. I would like to draw all of your attention, if you're interested, to a new website that we recently launched called the YIVO Digital Archive on Jewish Life in Poland, which you can find very easily just by going to our website. It's probably the most remarkable resource you will see in existence today on this subject. It has music, it has visual galleries, it has poetry, it has documents, all sorts of things. You can get lost in it. It is now being used by people around the globe. I want to thank, in particular, our partners for tonight's event. I want to thank the Jewish Review of Books and the Jewish Lives series, which is being published by Yale University Press. And I want to thank, in particular, Steve Zipperstein, who is the editor of that project, who is now the Jacob Cronhill visiting professor of East European Jewish history here at the YIVO Institute, and is teaching a course on Jews in the Russian Revolution. I urge you all, if you're interested more in the subject of Jabotinsky, in the subject of his world in Eastern Europe, of the great ferment around him, the context, to come and visit our resources, visit our website, go to our online catalogs, and I think you will find that the YIVO Institute, despite the fact that it is located here in the city of New York and is visible to all, is actually an unknown resource comparable to the Geniza in Cairo. Because we keep finding things we had no idea we had. And I'm sure that you will as well. I want to mention one more thing before I go, which is that in October of this year, October 22nd, we are going to be sponsoring with the Museum of the City of New York a major installation of our home movies that have been very imaginatively redesigned and reformed by the great video artist, great Hungarian video artist, Peter Forgas. This installation was first exhibited at the new Jewish Museum in Warsaw. We will have in October the premiere of this work in the United States. It will last through March, and it will travel to San Francisco in March of 2015. So please mark your calendars for that, because you will see things that you can really not imagine. So without saying more, I will welcome Abraham Socher to the podium to introduce tonight's panel.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to see you all here. So I'll just be very, very quick, and we'll all get started. On behalf of the Jewish Review of Books, Yale University Press's Jewish Lives series, and with great thanks to YIVO, I want to welcome you to this discussion of Rethinking Jabotinsky, occasioned by Hillel Halkin's terrific book, which, forgive a commercial plug, I believe you can purchase outside in the lobby at the end of the evening. Our panelists, I, by the way, edit the Jewish Review of Books and teach at Oberlin. Our panelists, Rebecca Kobrin is the Knapp Professor of American Jewish History at Columbia University. Ed Rothstein this is really the best title, or perhaps the second best professional title of which I'm aware. Edward Rothstein is the cultural critic at large of the New York Times. You're now wondering, what is the best title? George Steiner is or was Extraordinary Fellow at Churchill College, Cambridge, which could only be made better if he was Extraordinary Fellow and all-around good guy, but that wouldn't really fit George Steiner. So without further ado, I want to invite Hillel and our panelists up, and we'll begin the conversation. We'll begin first with Hillel talking a bit about how he came to write this book, and then reading a couple of passages. So, Hillel, how did you come to write this book?
Do you want the short answer or the long answer?
I want the long answer.
Well, I'll start with the short answer. And the short answer is that about 10 or 12 years ago, I was asked by the New Republic to write a review of a new English translation of Jabotinsky's novel, The Five, which is a novel set in Odessa, Jabotinsky's birthplace, in the beginning of the 20th century. And I read the novel and I was bowled over by it. I had never read anything written by Jabotinsky before, and I was really just bowled over by the talent and the fictional ability of this man, who I had only known of as a politician, really, until then. So I wrote, I think, what was a very long and laudatory review. And when Yale University began its Jewish Lives series 4 or 5 years ago, I guess because of the review that I had written, the editors turned to me and asked me if I would write the Jabotinsky biography. But if I were to try to briefly tell you the long answer, I came from a very labor Zionist home. I mean, not an ideologically labor Zionist home. My father was a passionate Zionist, but I don't remember him ever really talking Zionist politics very much. But in retrospect, I realized that the education I was given was very much a labor Zionist education. I went for years, for instance, to a Hebrew summer camp, a Zionist summer camp called Masad, which some of you here may be familiar with. only later did I realize how much we were indoctrinated in this camp in labor Zionism, because it was never anything that was, as a child, you understood quite. But we had, every bunk was named after a kibbutz. And, twice a week we were taken out to some dusty piece of land to plant radishes that never grew. And only later did I understand that this was Zionist, the conquest of the land, that Zionist chalutzim that we were emulating. And the head counselor his name was Shlomo Schulzinger, was a shoo-in for David Ben-Gurion. I mean, I think only his lack of a paunch could have enabled anyone to tell the difference between him, and so on and so forth. And this was really the worldview of Zionism that I grew up with, without quite realizing it. When we moved to Israel, my wife and I, in 1970, we bought land in a little farming town, what was then a little farming town called Zichron Yaakov, south of Haifa, which was settled by the first pre-labor Zionist pioneers, the pioneers of 1882, what's called the first Aliyah in Israel. Labor Zionist pioneering only begins really in 1905 with the so-called second Aliyah. And I became friendly with many of the old-timers, many of the old farmers who were still alive in the town at the time. And even wrote a book partly based on my acquaintance with them. And there I was exposed to a very, very different narrative of Zionist history, because the old farming settlements, the private farming settlements, hated the labor Zionists with a passion. I'll never forget how once I mentioned the name Ben-Gurion to a local farmer, a man who was probably then about 80 years old, and he said, "Ben-Gurion? The lazy bum. Do you know that he was here in 1906 working in Zichron? And all he did was stand with the hoe he was given to dig irrigation holes with and lean on it and lecture and give speeches to the other workers? No wonder he became prime minister. He was too lazy to work." But being exposed over the years to this other world, I think was for me the beginning of an entire reevaluation in the way of my thinking about Zionism, because I realized there was more than one story, more than one Zionist story and more than one Zionist narrative. I mean, today we hear about Zionist narratives and Palestinian narratives, but there was more than one Zionist narrative. And Jabotinsky is a key part of this other alternate Zionist narrative, which I was never exposed to as a child. So that I think when I came across his book and his novel, and later when I was asked to write this book, I was very ready to explore the man and very curious to explore the man. And that's the long answer.
Well then, perhaps now it's time to introduce the man himself, Jabotinsky.
Okay, you had asked me to read really two passages.
Yeah, what I thought is that you would choose as you have an early passage and a late passage, but first just to tell us a bit about this passage. This first passage is one about his childhood, correct?
The first passage is a passage that occurs at the beginning of the book. It's about Jabotinsky's upbringing in Odessa in the 1880s and 1890s.
And we should say that what's the standard picture of his
Well,
upbringing?
Jabotinsky was by many of his own Zionist, Eastern European Zionist contemporaries, and is today by many contemporary Jewish historians considered to have come from what's called an assimilated Jewish background. And there's a version of Jabotinsky that he came from a very assimilated Jewish home. He discovered Zionism only when he was in his early 20s, and he was a kind of born-again Jew and became a born-again Jew via Zionism and via his discovery of it. And as I argue, I think in my book, this is very far from the truth. Jabotinsky came from a home where his Yiddish-speaking mother, he himself was raised in Russian, but his Yiddish-speaking mother lit Sabbath candles every Friday night and kept a kosher kitchen. And Jabotinsky, although he never had much to do with synagogues or Jewish ritual and never cared for it very much, was far from coming from an assimilated home. He was assimilated only, and this is what I try to say in the passage I'm about to read. He could be considered assimilated only by the standards of the Eastern European shtetl, in which he did not grow up. He grew up in Odessa, which was a very different kind of place than the shtetl. So here's the first of the passages that I'd like to read. It will take me about 5-6 minutes, I guess. All this does not add up to an assimilated Jewish background. Why then did the myth of one develop? In part because to other Eastern European Zionist leaders of his generation, like Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion, Jabotinsky really did seem a kind of half-breed. The Weizmanns and Ben-Gurions were products of the shtetl. They were raised in Yiddish, were given their first education in the Cheder, the religiously orthodox Jewish schoolhouse in which secular subjects were rarely taught, socialized as boys exclusively with other Jewish youngsters, and learned the languages of the generally anti-Semitic Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, among whom they lived, only later. Their world was divided into Jews and non-Jews, the latter viewed as alien and hostile. Ben-Gurion, who in the 1930s headed the more diplomatically and territorially compromising Zionist left against the more militant right led by Jabotinsky, once remarked that the latter was the only Zionist politician he knew who had not the slightest instinctive fear of Gentiles and could never be intimidated by them. Although this was meant as a compliment, the inference was, as Weizmann was to put it more baldly in his autobiography, Trial and Error, that Jabotinsky had something not at all Jewish about him. This might have been a reasonable way of describing Jabotinsky had he grown up elsewhere than Odessa. Only in Odessa could an Eastern European Jew feel both deeply Jewish and totally at ease among non-Jews, because only there did Jews and non-Jews mix in truly neutral spaces. Early on in The Five, that's Jabotinsky's novel that I spoke of, the narrator, recalling his years as a young Odessan journalist who frequented the town's writers' club, remarks, "Looking back on all this some 30 years later, I think that the most curious thing about it was the good-natured fraternization of nationalities. All 8 or 10 tribes of old Odessa met in that club, and in fact it never occurred to anyone, even in silence, to note who was who. In our homes, it seemed, we lived apart, but we had yet to wonder why this was so, unconsciously considering it simply an indication of temporary oversight, and the Babylonian diversity of our common forum, a symbol of a splendid tomorrow." It was Yehuda Leib Gordon who had famously counseled Russian Jews, "Be a Jew at home and a human being when you leave it." Yet while societies in which one could live Jewishly in one's private life and as a citizen of the world outside it existed in many places in Europe in the second half of the 19th century, in Berlin, Paris, and Vienna, for example, all capitals of countries where Jews were fully emancipated, or in Herzl's Budapest, this was possible in Tsarist Russia, in Odessa alone. It was not as an assimilated Jew that Jabotinsky grew up there, but as the anomaly of a Western or Central European type Jew in Eastern Europe. The feeling of many Eastern European Zionists that he was not one of them, the inner life of Jewry had left no trace on him, wrote Weizmann, was of a piece with their attitude toward Western and Central European Zionism as a whole. Such feelings were also had about Herzl. He too was raised more Jewishly than was commonly acknowledged by his Eastern European critics, who misattributed much of what they disliked about him to a total absence of Jewish roots. Nor was it only they who thought his Zionism derived from a born-again sense of Jewish identity that he did not grow up with. Many of his followers also regarded him as a Moses figure, a Jew raised in Pharaoh's court, as it were, with no sense of connection to his fellow Israelites. Part of the fascination of Moses' story lies in his having adopted the persecuted people of his ancestors when he could have led the privileged life of an Egyptian prince. And a similar legend accrued to Herzl. Unlike the Zionism of the Weizmanns and Ben-Gurions, which aspired to solve not only the Jewish predicament, but their own predicament as Jews, Herzl's Zionism seemed disinterested and therefore grander, a selfless act of devotion to his rediscovered brethren with whom he, the acclaimed European journalist and playwright, was under no compulsion to be associated. For his self-sacrifice, Jews felt awe and gratitude. By it, their self-esteem was heightened, since his giving up so much to be their savior could only mean that they were worth giving it up for. Jabotinsky, a rising star like Herzl in the worlds of journalism and theater, when he abandoned both for full-time Zionist activity, was to inspire similar emotions. But the parallel is not just between him and Herzl, or even between him and young Western European Jews of his era. It is also between him and many young Jews of our own age, whose upbringing, while not at all like Weizmann's or Ben-Gurion's, is a great deal like Jabotinsky's in Odessa. Whether acquired at home, in school, in the synagogue, or elsewhere, their Jewishness must compete with other possibilities of self-definition. Weizmann, though he could have decided after settling in England to devote himself solely to his work as a chemist without getting involved in Zionist politics, could not have decided not to live as a Jew. He already was one through and through, and it would have been psychologically impossible for him to have lived simply as an Englishman or private individual without Jewish ties and obligations. This was not true of Jabotinsky. Odessa had instilled in him, alongside his Jewish identity, a potentially non-Jewish one as well. In one of his early Zionist essays, he recalled walking there with two Jewish companions and seeing a Jew with the long earlocks and kaftan of the shtetl approach them. Although the man felt clearly nervous to be so conspicuously Jewish in a Russian crowd, he was also, Jabotinsky reflected, more sure of himself than they were, because they had from, quote, childhood on grown up with the knowledge that we were Jewish but didn't have to be. And now the passage, I'll go to the other end of my book, which is not a long one. The passage I'm now about to read just demands also a very brief introduction. In the epilogue of the book, which this comes from, I bring Jabotinsky back to life, as it were, for an hour's conversation with him in a cafe in Paris, where Jabotinsky lived for many years and was a city he loved greatly. And I write that Jabotinsky spent many, many hours with his revisionist colleagues after work in Parisian cafes and brasseries, where they talked about all kinds of things, art and theater and philosophy and intellectual life and Odessa and Paris and women and restaurants. The one thing that it was a rule among them never to talk about after hours was Zionism. And that was Jabotinsky's rule. And now I write, he had given his life to it, but needed to keep a space free of it. Ultimately, Vera Weizmann, this was Chaim Weizmann's wife, who earlier in the book I quote as telling Jabotinsky that he was not cut out to be a politician. Ultimately, Vera Weizmann may have been right, that politics were not his true vocation. Herzl died young and thwarted, but he had created political Zionism. Weizmann ended as an irrelevance, the figurehead first president of a Jewish state he had never wanted to fight for. Yet he was instrumental in keeping Zionism alive in the years after Herzl's death, and in obtaining the Balfour Declaration, without which it could have gone no further. Ben-Gurion, more than anyone, could claim credit for the establishment of Israel, at whose helm he imposingly stood in its first years. His rupture in old age with the Mapai leadership he had fallen out with was but a melancholy postscript to a triumphant career. Jabotinsky, apart from his partial success with the Jewish Legion, which did not substantially change Zionism's course, was a political failure, the perennial leader of the Zionist opposition. More prescient about most things than the men he opposed, He never had their power to influence events. He was one of the first to anticipate that England would win World War I and drive the Turks from Palestine, and that Zionism's future lay with it. He foresaw ahead of others that British governments would betray the Balfour Declaration unless sufficient pressure was exerted on them not to. He understood from the start that socialism could not develop the economy of Palestine fast enough to attract massive Jewish immigration and was not in the long run a viable economic system. He grasped early on that European Jewry was on the verge of a catastrophe from which it could be saved only by a Jewish state. He realized before anyone that the struggle for Palestine would be decided by a Jewish-Arab war. Weizmann and Ben-Gurion eventually came to see these things too. Ben-Gurion sometimes sooner than Weizmann, but Jabotinsky saw them sooner than either of them. Was he responsible for his own failure? Could he have gained control of the Zionist movement had he made less stubborn, less prideful, tactically wiser decisions? Fought, say, to return to Palestine in 1930, when he was banned from it by the British, or chosen to stay in the Zionist organization in 1934, which is when he seceded from it. History has no answers to what-if questions. Neither can it tell us whether, had Jabotinsky been in Weizmann and Ben-Gurion's place in the years before World War II, he could have done anything they didn't. Were the grandiose plans that he hatched, petitions with millions of signatures, diplomatic pacts with European governments, a Jewish army landing on the shores of Palestine, or fighting the Wehrmacht, were they ever more than the wild fantasies they were derided as by the Zionist left? Was he who so trenchantly criticized the left's delusions, the victims of ones at least as great? He was a man of contradictions. He had enormous literary talent and wrote a vast amount, most of it journalism and political polemic, in which this talent was but dimly reflected. He dedicated himself to a people and a land that he never found particularly attractive. A firm believer in individualism, that's Jabotinsky's word, he developed a philosophy of revolutionary Zionism that called for the utter subordination of the individual to the group. He abhorred fascism, yet founded a political party and a youth movement that were repeatedly accused of it. In his personal relations with others, he scrupulously treated them as equals. As a political leader, he allowed a personality cult to form around him. The author of a novel that condemned the loss of the concept of the forbidden, he sanctioned the spilling of innocent blood. If there was a common denominator in all this, it was of someone who became what he did by acting against his deeper instincts, or rather, whose deepest instinct was to overrule all his other instincts in the name of a single willed goal. This self-denial had a brio that made it seem like self-assertion. It was self-assertion. Perhaps here lies the resolution of the paradox of freedom and duty that had already occupied him as a young man in Odessa.
So before we move on, just at the end of all this thought about Jabotinsky, do you think he made the wrong decision? Ought he to have written he said he had 11 novels in his head?
Jabotinsky said, and writes in a letter to someone, he says, I have 11, towards the end of his life, he says, I have 11 unwritten novels in my mind. He wrote 2 novels, The Five, which I've spoken of, and a novel set in biblical times about Samson, called Samson the Nazarene, which is also a wonderful novel.
And for which he has screen credit.
Right. It was bought by Paramount Pictures in 1938 for $666, which Jabotinsky immediately passed on to the revisionist party to cover its debts, even though he himself was heavily in debt at the time. And it then was produced as a movie in 1949, starring Victor Mature and Hedy Lamarr, It grossed $11 million at the box office, and Jabotinsky is listed in the credits. You know, you asked me a tough question, Abe. Literature, I think, did lose a great deal by Jabotinsky's decision not to devote himself to it full time. Jabotinsky lost a great deal. On the contrary, even if I've called him a political failure, the Jewish people gained a great deal. If I just may go on for a second, in Jabotinsky's novel, The Five, which is about 5 brothers and sisters growing up in Odessa in the early 20th century, the main figure is a wonderful young woman named Marussia, who the narrator is clearly in love with, although it never matures into an actual love affair. Marussia eventually marries and comes to a tragic death when she dies in a fire. It takes place when she's warming milk for her little son on a stove and her nightgown catches fire. And instead of stripping off the nightgown to save herself, which anyone else would have done, the first thing she does is she takes a broom and she pushes her little son out of the kitchen and locks the door to make sure that her son doesn't try to come and save her or hug her and catch fire himself. That's her first thought. Her second thought is to take the key and throw it out the window. And only then does she try to strip off her burning nightgown, and it's already too late, and she dies. And the narrator can't at first understand why she throws the key out the window, but then a friend of his explained this to me. He says, had she kept the key, she might at the last minute rush to the door. She thought she might have rushed the door and opened it again to try to escape, and her son might still have been endangered. So she throws the key out the window to make sure there's no possibility of her fleeing the locked kitchen. And she thus saves her son and burns to death. Now, when I wrote the New Republic Review in 2004, 2005, I wrote, without really understanding exactly what I was saying, that I thought Marussia was in some ways a projection, a fictional projection of Jabotinsky himself. And that when he wrote of her character and her death, he was in some ways talking of his own life and fate. This was only rather astonishingly confirmed for me in the course of writing this book about Jabotinsky, when I came across a memoir of him, about him, that as far as I know, no one else has ever noticed. There was an actress, a Tel Aviv actress named Miriam Cohen Bernstein, who knew Jabotinsky, and who wrote a short memoir of him after his death. And in that memoir, she writes, without referring to this novel, and I'm not even sure she knew about it, she writes, Jabotinsky once told me that he had in his soul 2 keys to 2 different gates. One was the key to literature, and one was the key to the Jewish people. And he knew that if he didn't throw away the key to the literature, he would never be able to devote his life to the Jewish people. So he took the key to literature, and he threw it as far away from him as he could into the deepest water. Well, that speaks for itself in terms of the ending of the novel. And of course, Marussia was, in many ways, a fictional projection of Jabotinsky. That's the sacrifice that he knew he made. You know, was it worthwhile? I think so. But on some ultimate scale of judgment, that it's hard to weigh anything on.
But he wrote well, tell us when he wrote The Five, because it complicates what you've just said.
Jabotinsky writes The Five in 1934, 1935, 5-6 years before his death, when he's a man in his mid-50s. He died very young of a heart attack in 1940, in America, by the way. He writes it at a time when it's almost impossible to understand how he could have written it, because it's politically the busiest year of a very, very busy life. It's the year he secedes from the Zionist organization, founds his own new Zionist organization, spends every day running from meeting to meeting, conference to conference, rally to rally, city to city, travels back and forth across Eastern and Western Europe. Doesn't seem to have a free moment in his life. And it's this period that he sits down and he writes the 5 in. How he did it, I don't know. I can only imagine that he stole minutes here and he stole them there, on train rides and waiting stations, before speeches, after speeches, waiting to be picked up to be taken for an appearance. Late at night when he had finished everything else, early in the morning before he had started everything. It's incredible to think that he wrote a great, great novel in this particular year.
So I just want to hold this question, and we'll all hold you to it later. But I think you haven't told us yet. He was prescient. He saw things coming before others. But I think you haven't yet told us. Thank you. I think you haven't yet told us what his contribution to political thought or the Zionist movement is. You don't have to answer now.
Okay,
you can think about it while Ed and Rebecca talk.
Well, I feel a little bit superfluous because actually I'm content to keep listening. The book is so successful because you really do get a very nuanced view of this man and of the complexities of his personality, his ideas. And when I was thinking about today and talking, one of the things that, in a way, the book is so commonsensical and made me feel that I came to know Jabotinsky so much more than I had in the past, that I had to remind myself that Jabotinsky was actually vilified by labor Zionists over the course of decades, and actually not just labor Zionists. I mean, it's sort of taken as sort of axiomatic that there were sort of two branches of Zionism, and the good guys won, in a sense. Well, let's say I'm glad the good guys won in the sense that Israel came to be, but that in a sense, Jabotinsky was shed as a sort of unnecessary and distracting figure who, had he been more forceful or more effective at what he was doing, we would regret it all today. And this point of view actually was really dominant, I think, also through my childhood and through reading that I'd even done since. And I thought one of the things that's so unusual about Jabotinsky when you compare him to some of the other figures in Zionism, not just the founding generation, but also the next generation of Sabras, is that there really was a utopian vision in the labor Zionist strand of Zionism and in its various ramifications over the following decades that really was sort of alien to Jabotinsky, that Jabotinsky was not involved in thinking about the new Jew, the new world, the new land, and some sort of transformation that would take place that would fundamentally alter how human beings interacted or how they were Jews. That for Jabotinsky, this was simply, well, I shouldn't say nothing was simply, but this was just something that had to be, and it was necessary. And it didn't matter what, and I think you actually have, you cite him saying at one point, you know, I don't care if it's a socialist state or what the ideology is of the organization behind the society. That's not my interest. My interest is that there is the need now for a Jewish state, and this is what must be done. So anyway, in thinking about this, I thought, well, what could I bring up that would give some sense of the real contrast to Jabotinsky, because things have changed since then. And I returned to some writings of the 1980s, which was really the decade. I remember Begin came to power in 1977, and it was really this sort of triumph of revisionist Zionism, or the first chance of revisionist Zionism to make a statement. And then soon after that came the Lebanese war in Israel, which led to years of sort of disenchantment, anger, and confusion. But in the midst of the 1980s, when this was happening, this sort of like dramatic, historic turnaround that then became messy, you had people like Amos Oz, Miron Benveniste, all essentially second generation, a generation away from the founders, writing about how Israel had lost its soul or lost its direction, and sometimes explicitly seeming to invoke Jabotinsky, sometimes simply talking about the state as if it had somehow been taken over by alien forces that they had no connection with. And I was really kind of startled in going back to some of this stuff at the level of comment that was being, if I can find it here. We originally had a slightly different format. During the Lebanese War, Amos Oz in the New York Times said that once Israel could have become an exemplary state, a small-scale laboratory for democratic socialism. And then he said came Holocaust refugees, anti-socialist Zionists, chauvinistic, militaristic, and xenophobic North African immigrants, groups who cherished bourgeois coziness and respectability, and that by 1977, when Begin was elected, Israel had become a small militant nation state, armed to the teeth and committed to medieval religious fundamentalism. That was right. That was during the Vietnam War, in the pages of the New York Times Magazine, in a piece by Amos Oz. A few years later, Miron Benveniste, in writing his memoirs, complained that the pioneering values and social justice of old are being displaced by middle-class hedonistic culture, rampant chauvinism, ethnic and national discrimination, clerical influence, political malaise, economic and social instability. And he remembered that there was a time when we were, meaning Israelis, were to become the new Jews, capitalizes NNJ, and that part of this was this passion that they had for the secular ideology of socialism, but also a devotion to the land, which was known in Hebrew as a sort of devotion to moledet. This involved sort of ardent hikes through the wilderness, this is actually interesting because if you trace this idea of the cult of moledet that Benveniste talks about as being sort of crucial to the Chalutzim and the following generation. In a way, if you go to the Israel Museum now and you look at how the Israel Museum recounts the history over the last 2-3 millenniums, what you find is that the Israel Museum as a national museum is very strange because it doesn't concentrate on the birth of the nation or try to inspire some sort of national sense. Its devotion is to the land, and almost every single label talks about the land as opposed to the place or the people. So this idea of moledet and the devotion to it, Benveniste then complains, became replaced by essentially something like crude patriotism and narrow-mindedness. In his words, he said, "We were a caste, the sons and daughters of a revolutionary elite, strong and in love with ourselves." And he means some irony a bit about this, but when he starts attacking a chauvinist fundamentalist cult and how the Israelis that followed his generation no longer believed in raising man to a higher plane. In fact, they essentially hijacked the ideology of the Chalutzim by, especially the religious organizations, by having their own settlements and their own sort of ideology and their own view of what being a pioneer was. And Benveniste, the animus that comes through in the midst of this is really very startling, especially with the perspective of 30 years. Well, a lot of that is because entire intellectual climate, the dominant intellectual climate of Israel for about 30 years was really involved in opposition, creating an opposition to, I wouldn't say Jabotinsky himself, but it was tied to this idea of the messianic view of transformation, human transformation, that somehow could justify the entire Zionist project. That is, the Zionist project would save the Jews by transcending Jews, essentially eliminate the particular by embracing a universalist sort of dream. And that one of the things that's so interesting about the turning to Jabotinsky now is that there really is this sort of, even when one disagrees with him or finds him inconsistent, this sort of blast of reality, a sort of like somebody saying, stop the dreaming, you know, there is we were talking a little bit just before this session, and I'll stop. I was reading an essay by Netanyahu's father, historian Ben Zion. He ends this discussion of early Zionist leaders by quoting Jabotinsky's talk on Tisha B'Av in 1938 in Warsaw to Polish Jews. And it's really it's such an incredible thing. I'll just read like three or four lines of it just to give you the contrast between this and the sentiment of utopian dream that sort of characterized what I was saying right before. So this is Jabotinsky in 1938. It is for 3 years that I have been calling on you, Jews of Poland, the glory of world Jewry, with an appeal. I have been ceaselessly warning you that the catastrophe is coming closer. My hair has turned white and I have aged in these years because my heart is bleeding for you, dear brothers and sisters. You do not see the volcano that will soon begin to spurt out the fire of destruction. But I see a terrifying sight. The time is short in which one can still be saved. I know you do not see because you are bothered and rushing about with everyday worries. But listen to my remarks at the 12th hour, for God's sake. It's really startling.
Hillel, do you want to say anything in response before we turn to Rebecca?
I think that Ed Rothstein spoke very eloquently and truly now about Jabotinsky. The only issue on which I might partly disagree with him is that you're entirely right, Ed. Jabotinsky was an anti-utopian, and in general thought that Marxist thinking and utopian thinking was delusional and harmful ultimately. But in his own sense of the Jewish future, and particularly in the youth movement, Beitar, that he created, he too was thinking of a new kind of Jew. It's not entirely true to say that he wasn't. Jabotinsky had an appreciation of the Jewish middle class and the Jewish commercial class and Jewish bourgeois life that the Zionist left didn't. But his whole concept of what he called famously hadar, which was the key word in Beitar and his youth movement, and hadar can be translated as dignity or majesty or pride of bearing. Jabotinsky wanted to create not a new social system. He was not for transforming society, but he wanted to create a new, prouder, more dignified Jew, a Jew who in a way was the very antithesis of the labor Zionist Chalutz, who Jabotinsky, for all his admiration for the energy and devotion of the Chalutzim, thought that there was somehow shabby and indifferent to aesthetic values and indifferent to appearances and unaware of the importance of ceremony and ritual and all of those kind of conducts that refine and elevate human life. And Jabotinsky very much wanted to introduce into Jewish life that kind of refinement and elegance, if you will, and culture that he felt was lacking in both in Eastern European Jewish life and in the Jewish life of the Palestinian Yishuv. So he too did have a vision of newness, but it was a newness that was, for Jabotinsky, I think, compatible with oldness. It was a newness that could be contained within the oldness, within traditional ways of life and traditional ways of economic and social life. He just wanted that traditional life to be higher, finer, more transcending in some ways.
One place Jabotinsky definitely did not think of as refined was here, America. I think you have something to say about Jabotinsky in America, Rebecca.
Thank you, and I just wanted to thank YIVO and the Jewish Review of Books and Steve Zipperstein, who's not here but is really behind this whole panel. And I would say one of the things that was remarkable, the reason I'm here is I read another biography by Hillel Halkin, his masterful biography of Yehuda Halevi. And I'm no expert on Jabotinsky, but I wanted to see what he would do with a person who is so often summoned, reviled, misremembered. And indeed, this biography is remarkable in the way it places Jabotinsky in two different contexts. One, the social, cultural, and political history of the fin de siècle Europe, and the history of Zionism. And what I enjoyed the most, and this is my work, is how you always make very clear how place is important. We heard a little bit about Odessa, you talk about Paris and Palestine, and indeed, while Zionism is this nationalist movement, local sensibilities and concerns really inform the way different people approach it. But what I really just want to focus on, and this is what Steve Zipperstein wanted me to focus on as well, is, and I'm glad you read that excerpt about failure, because what I think is we're rethinking Jabotinsky, it's really useful to rethink how we conceptualize, theorize, and talk about failure in Jewish history. Because as you heard from the excerpt, the quote is, he's a political failure, the perennial leader of a Zionist opposition, and is he responsible for his own failure? And what all I could think about is, and my own work looks at failed Jewish bankers, bankers who go bankrupt, but in the early 20th century, not contemporary, and I'm always thinking about how these people have been literally erased from Jewish history. No one knows their names. So while we know Jabotinsky's names, how we deal with people we consider failures in the writing of Jewish history. So it is true, to be sure, that he never won an election or he never became a leader in the Zionist Congress, nor did revisionist Zionists ever hold a majority in any of the elections. And by 1930, he's not allowed to live in Palestine anymore. By 1934, he's basically seceded from the Zionist movement, the movement that he sought to lead. But are we solely going to evaluate success through Zionist Congress electoral politics? Because it's against this backdrop that is very evocatively described in the book, that revisionist Zionists made major inroads in American Jewry, indeed winning over the community so much so that revisionist Zionist leaders become the leaders of American Zionism by 1948. So what the volume ends before, and the epilogue I love, with the conjuring up of Jabotinsky, which you left out. He weighs in on what should be how the current Arab-Israeli crisis should be solved. And Jabotinsky would have loved that because he had this immense literary imagination. But what I was just thinking about is that the volume ends in 1940 when Jabotinsky dies. But if you actually took it forward just for the next 8 years, you would see that in the United States, well, let's just say in the 1930s, Jabotinsky was reviled in the United States just like he was in Europe, or suspect of being a fascist, and many other things. By a decade later, his followers hold key positions in American Zionism and are seen as the voice of American Zionism, and they're giving voice to many of Jabotinsky's views. Indeed, revisionist Zionists convince politicians, people in the entertainment industry, journalists, that members of the Irgun are reincarnations of American heroes, and we should think it's no coincidence that Paul Newman plays Ari Ben Canaan in Exodus because of the effort of revisionist Zionists just to convince Americans that what is taking place in Palestine and then Israel is really a re-rendering of the American story. Revisionist Zionists enlist people like Billy Rose, Jerry Lewis, Frank Sinatra, all to participate in theatrical pageants that are written by a man, Ben Hecht, that basically argue for the need for a Jewish army. And then there's, in addition, the whole Beitar movement and the camps. And we can't forget that the Beitar movement advocates for Jews to learn to be tough, fighting, in some ways a new Jews. But success and failure depends on which continent you're viewing Jabotinsky from. Because clearly from the Yishuv in the 1930s, which, as Anita Shapiro has shown, was avowedly anti-militaristic, from America, Jabotinsky is an extreme wild success. And in many ways, his ideology and the work of his revisionist Zionist followers, the Bergson boys are the most famous, are part of the reason that it is seen that not only American Jewry, but America is so behind the Zionist project in 1948. Indeed, revisionist Zionist followers are masters of public relations, and they play a key role in stimulating or enticing American Jewry to make donations once 1948 becomes a reality. And while we know that Jabotinsky would have liked them all to have gone to Israel and fight, no war can be won without arms. The revisionist Zionists were also involved in the smuggling of arms to Israel, or without funds. So I just want to end that as we're reimagining this place of Jabotinsky in modern Jewish history and Zionism, if we think about at which moments and in which ways, when we're thinking about Begin or back in 1948, did Jabotinsky and his revisionist Zionism play a central role in shaping the Zionist project? I think we want to just keep in mind where we're viewing it from, which continent, which ideology. I mean, the ideology that comes with the continent, because clearly from the vantage point of the United States, it would be a totally different story if Jabotinsky and his followers had not been here. So, thank you.
You know, writing this book, as writing books often is, was a process of education for me, not just concerning Jabotinsky, but concerning many details of Zionist history that I hadn't necessarily been aware of before. But because Jabotinsky dies in 1940, my education stops in 1942 in a certain sense. And I say this because I may be entirely wrong about what I'm about to say. Your remarks puzzle me, Rebecca, because as I describe it in my book, certainly, until Jabotinsky's death, his movement, the revisionist movement, was very, very weak in America. And Jabotinsky never really succeeded in building much of a base in America during his lifetime. And I'm not at all sure how much it changed after his death. You mentioned, for instance, the Bergsonites and you know, the group of pro-revisionist, pro-Irgun people who found, like, what is it called, the Emergency Committee for European Jewry and tried desperately in the 42, 43, 44 to mobilize American Jewry, to put pressure on the Roosevelt administration to take practical steps towards saving the Jews of Europe. But the Bergsonites, as far as I know, are a total failure in America. The Bergsonites get nowhere. They're totally rejected by the American Jewish establishment, which, to the best of my knowledge, remains pro-labor Zionist and wants nothing to do with Peter Bergson and his followers. In 1940, shortly before Jabotinsky's death, he comes to America with the project, which I think was at that point really grasping at a straw, but the project of trying to found a Jewish army that would fight along with the Allies in World War II. He first tries to sell this idea in England, and no one wants to buy it, I think for very understandable reasons. It was not a practical idea. But then he comes to America, and he tries to sell it in America. And again, he gets nowhere. No one apart from his own small group of followers, wants to hear about it. He gives the revisionists hold 2 or 3 months before Jabotinsky's death a great rally in what was then I forget the name of the building. It was the original house of the Metropolitan Opera on 8th Avenue. And thousands of people come to this rally, but not a single American Jewish Zionist leader comes. Not a single ranking American Jewish politician comes. Jabotinsky is essentially boycotted, as he was every time he visited America in the 30s by the American Jewish establishment. And I mean, I would be interested in knowing, because I mean, who in 1948 are the revisionists? I mean, there is Abba Hillel Silver, who was sympathetic to Jabotinsky. But I can't really think of other names beside him who become the leaders of American Zionism in 1948.
So there's Abba Hillel Silver, but there's also the image of what the Zionist project is, which is projected to America, which is projected through a revisionist Zionist. The Bergson boys might have not met with the leaders of American Zionism, but they met with America, and they are the people who are creating and crafting and molding what the image of what Zionism is doing. Mm-hmm. So they are, and this is all about vantage point of what success and failure is. They might have not met with the leaders of the American Jewish Committee, but they are meeting with Frank Sinatra. So and that has, but that has right, value.
But we are jumping here from the 48 to the early 60s, aren't we?
No. In the 46, 47.
Frank Sinatra is active on behalf of...
Not active. They meet with Hollywood. Uh-huh. They're very savvy in public relations.
Through Ben Hur.
Yes. Yeah. So I just think that it's all, and that in many ways galvanizes America and American Jewry behind the Zionist project in a new way that might have not. So.
Just a shameless plug while Helena collects questions from the audience, and I think it is time to open it up. The Jewish Review of Books that many of you are holding actually has a piece by Stuart Schaffman about Ben Hecht and a 1948 fundraiser involving Hollywood and, in fact, gangsters for the Irgun.
Can
Go
I
ahead.
just add one thing about this? Because one of the things that I thought, Ben Hecht, in a way, I'm just wondering if he was an exception or the rule, because what I end up thinking about it is if I go back to look at books from the 1950s or pay attention to the 50s in the United States, the real appeal of Israel then, and it was a very strong appeal, was of the Chalutzim and the image of the sort of, I mean, the Weavers sort of celebrated them and, Tzena Tzena or something like that, that this was really the dream of a new sort of socialist world was so dominant then, or at least it seemed that way to me. I don't know if if things split or?
I mean, Ben Hecht moves away from what he's doing, and it's taken over by other people. I'm not sure I understand your question. If he's exceptional, I mean, he's the only one, so yes, he is exceptional, doing it in that period. But I'm more interested in like his impact, because he promulgates an image. He's a public relations person who uses Hollywood to promulgate a vision of what Zionism is, but it is a revisionist Zionist vision.
Okay, we're going to take a few questions from the audience.
Hi, thank you. That was great. I just wanted to ask you, besides the fact that you wrote a lot better than, as I can hear from what you said, than The Lone Wolf, which I read maybe 20 years ago. What did that guy get wrong? I mean, he also talked about Odessa and a lot of British documents and so on.
What did Katz get?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I think Shmuel Katz wrote, in many ways, did write a good book. It has its faults. It was, by the way, Katz's was not the first major biography of Jabotinsky. There was a much earlier and almost even longer biography than Katz's, or almost as long, written by Jabotinsky's colleague Joseph Shechtman, which also came out in English, called Jabotinsky, Rebel and Statesman, I believe. But I think that Katz's biography does suffer first from a certain hagiographical approach. I mean, unlike Shechtman, who was a colleague of Jabotinsky's and often criticized Jabotinsky in his lifetime and did not hesitate to criticize him for many things after his death in his biography, for all his love of the man, Katz is very reverential in Lone Wolf, and I think too reverential. He knew Jabotinsky as a young disciple of a much older man, and there's something of that attitude, that reverence of the young disciple for the old man that continues in the biography that Katz himself wrote as an old man. That would be my answer to you, I think.
I think it was a fascinating presentation. And I want to ask this, and of course I haven't read your book, which I will read, but I get the impression that you're, as many in the past have done, are branding Jabotinsky as a failure based on his accomplishments and the acceptance of his philosophy during his own lifetime. And my own thinking would be that you have to look to what happened afterwards, especially in the life and accomplishments of Menachem Begin, who everybody recognizes as his protege, both with the Irgun, whether you approve of the methods or not, before 48 as prime minister, the bombing of the Iraqi reactor, and also carried forward in Likud today, articulated. And if you were to broaden the time span, would you reach a somewhat different conclusion about whether the man was a success or a failure?
I think that's very true. And when I called Jabotinsky a failure, it was only within the context of his own lifetime. And even then, I think that one doesn't measure a man necessarily by the outward success or failure of his life. I think Jabotinsky's life has in it such extraordinary intelligence and even nobility that it's not a failure at all in terms of a human life. It's only a failure in terms of a politician who wanted power desperately because he was convinced that he knew better than anyone else what should be done with power in the Zionist world, and who never was able to achieve that power. The question of Jabotinsky's legacy in the Likud, I think, is a complicated one. I myself, for a long time, really had my doubts about how true an heir of Jabotinsky, Menachem Begin, was in many ways. Today, I having thought about the question at some length and even spoken at it at a little conference yesterday, I think you're right. I think Begin was very much a true follower of Jabotinsky's. But the Likud that came after Begin in many ways was not and is not. And I think Jabotinsky would have been very satisfied with Begin, but would be in many ways very disappointed with the Likud and the post-Begin era. Jabotinsky was ultimately a great believer in parliamentary democracy, in liberal democracy, in human rights, strange as that may seem to some of you. Jabotinsky was adamant about Arabs having full democratic rights in any Jewish state in which they existed as a minority. And Jabotinsky was in many ways much more adamant about this than the Zionist left. You know, in 1936, for instance, when the Peel Commission, the British commission that first suggested partitioning Palestine, and suggested partitioning into a very small Jewish state and a much larger Arab state, the Peel Commission wanted to sweeten the pill for the Jews and for the Yishuv by suggesting that all the Arabs be transferred out, all of the Arabs who lived within the borders of what was to be a small Jewish state be transferred out of it to make more room for Jews. There was, on the part of the Zionist left, considerable interest in this idea. Jabotinsky was categorically against it. And Jabotinsky said, absolutely no. No Arab is going to be transferred from his home in a Jewish Palestine. And I think this part of Jabotinsky, which did continue, in my opinion, to motivate Menachem Begin and to be part of Menachem Begin's worldview, has largely disappeared entirely from the Likud subsequently. I think the last Jabotinskyan alive today in the Likud, but he's no longer politically active, is perhaps Moshe Arens, who was a Beitarnik himself, and who was defense minister in Israel for many years, and who was a true Jabotinsky, and even writes occasionally today in a truly Jabotinskyan spirit. But apart from that, I think it's very hard to find Jabotinskians in the Likud today, even if there's a huge portrait of Jabotinsky behind the stage at every Likud convention.
I actually grew up in Beitar. I knew Menachem Begin very well. And one of the things I wanted to say was Jabotinsky clearly wanted to create a new Jew, but he considered the Jews who were judging other Jews to be very elitist, and he was very much a Jew of the common man. So the beginning of Beitar, the mission of Beitar, is to create that kind of Jew which is normal and healthy for the state. Because when Jabotinsky looked at the Eastern European Jews, he saw that these were not Jews prepared to do everything that a country needs. Yes, the country needs pioneers, but the country also needs soldiers, and the country needs carpenters, and the country needs everything. And I believe he found that that was part of the issue. And I remember my father saying when he was in the camps, when Jabotinsky died in 1940, the Germans, the Nazis, were told the Jews, basically, your last hope is now dead. And my father was, they were very demoralized at the time. I think that what happens in the world today when I listen to people talk about Jabotinsky, they set Jabotinsky up as a straw man, and they say, this was the way he thought, when it's a convenient way to say he thought that way. He was a very liberal person, but he believed in the strength of the Jewish people, and he believed that you have to be strong. So when we say Jabotinsky, when you talk about the view of Jabotinsky through some of the people that you were discussing, it really isn't the way Jabotinsky thought. It's a convenient way to set up a straw man. Jabotinsky was a man of the people. He loved all the Jewish people, and he really wanted to create that kind of Jew which was normal and healthy for the state, because shtetl Jews couldn't have built a state.
Daniel Gordis does a masterful job of tracing Jabotinsky's intellectual, the roots of the right in Israel, of Netanyahu, and of his predecessor Begin, his intellectual predecessor Begin, and on Netanyahu's father, and on Begin himself, and he references Jabotinsky's poem, The City of the Dead, and the tremendous effect it had on Begin. and he vividly describes Begin as electrified by Jabotinsky, clearly as his intellectual heir. As regards to a Likud person who believes in the things that I always thought that Jabotinsky was the one who said both sides of the Jordan, and Caroline Glick just wrote a book which basically says, let's take over Area C, and so that's a Jabotinsky type of idea. With regard to the comment about Jabotinsky being successful in the States, I grew up in America at that time, and Beitar was a fringe, for sure. First of all, they love guns, and no Jews love guns. And almost all the Jews were Democrats, and Beitarniks were right-wing, and they were clearly a fringe minority in every way, rejected by the great number of American Jews who had nothing to do with them and had no interest, and totally rejected them because of their affinity, their political affinity towards labor Zionism. So I think he's a success in Bibi Netanyahu has been prime minister longer than anybody else in the state of Israel. He's clearly an heir to his intellectual legacy.
Let's just not forget that Jabotinsky wanted to save 6 million European Jews, the 6 million European Jews who died. He didn't, and that is not a success. Jabotinsky had, as we've said tonight, and some of you have said, had a clearer premonition than any other Zionist leader of the doom that was awaiting European Jewry. He was consumed in his last years by trying to move Zionism and the idea of a Jewish state ahead as quickly as possible, because he thought that only such a state could save European Jews. And I think he was right. But he failed in that. He was not able to take control of the Zionist movement. None of his ideas for hastening the creation of a Jewish state was implemented or put into practice. I don't know if they were feasible, but they were never given the chance to prove if they were feasible or not. And I think Jabotinsky himself died with a great sense of failure. Jabotinsky died in America in 1940, apart from his own small group of followers, among whom was Ben-Zion Netanyahu, Jabotinsky died feeling very isolated, very ineffective, very unable to communicate with the American Jewish public or the American non-Jewish public or the Western public in terms of the desperate plight of European Jewry and of the need to include European Jewry and world Jewry in the war effort. What happened afterwards, of course, there are many cases, I think, of men who felt like failures and who in some ways did fail in their lifetimes, who became inspiring examples to later generations. And in that sense, they weren't failures. But Jabotinsky did not succeed in what he set out to do.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions.
I too would like to thank the entire panel. It was a wonderful evening, not yet over. Question for Mr. Rothstein, please. You quoted one of the great, great speeches of all time, the Tisha B'Av 1938 speech, warning, begging the Polish Jews to get out while they could. And he called them the crown of European Jewry. To my knowledge, and I've tried to get this from the Jabotinsky archive, there are only 4 paragraphs of that speech extant. Do any of you know more than what you were good enough to read?
I just got it out of Ben-Zion's essay on early Zionist leaders.
I can't tell you specifically, but Jabotinsky's speeches to Polish Jewry in the last years were all given in Yiddish, which he did not grow up as a fluent speaker in, but which he learned to be absolutely fluent in. And most, if not all, of those speeches were published in the Yiddish press in Jabotinsky's time, mostly at that stage in the Yiddish newspaper Moment, which was of the two great Yiddish newspapers, Polish Yiddish newspapers, Heint and Moment. Heint was anti-Jabotinskian and Moment was pro. So that would be the place to look. But beyond that, I don't know. I don't know if there are archives in which copies of Moment still exist or have survived. I couldn't tell you that.
Hillel, I'm sorry.
YIVO has Moment from this era.
Well, and that's the place to look.
I and everyone else appreciate greatly this scintillating discourse. I wanted to ask you, that the moment at which the conflicting visions of Zionism came to the worst conflict was, as you know, in the terrible story about what happened with the battle around the Alt-Neuland, the boat which the revisionists tried bringing into tried bringing in, and then there was an actual battle which took place, not a huge battle, but still Jews were killed in the course of that battle as they tried to bring the arms in. And around 20 years ago, roughly, I remember a large meeting here in New York when an Israeli filmmaker presented a documentary she had made about that conflict and about how people look back on it. And I went to that, and I remember people were practically fighting in the aisles. There were participants from both sides who were really, it's a Schulgen, einer die andere. I mean, they were ready literally to beat each other up. It was unbelievable, the intensity and the passion, which so many decades later, that story still evoked here. And I'm struck by, with all the enormous interest we all feel in this, we're not beating each other up tonight, physically at least. I mean, and I wonder if we've come to a different point in looking back on Jabotinsky's career and we're able to integrate it from different points of view in some way. And you feel that we've reached some kind of a different point in our discourse, in our integration of his contribution.
I hate to hog the conversation. Yes, I think what you say is absolutely true. I had that feeling in writing the book. I think the title given to tonight's session, Rethinking Jabotinsky, is about that too. Jabotinsky was for a very, very long time the victim of two stereotypes. One, the stereotype pinned on him by his enemies and detractors, and one, the stereotype pinned on him by his admirers and followers. I think both stereotypes, in a sense, flattened the man and turned a complexly three-dimensional figure into a two-dimensional one. I would add also that I think there is a third stereotype of Jabotinsky that in some ways has risen in opposition to the first two stereotypes, and it is also a stereotype, and that is the stereotype of Jabotinsky as a classical European liberal, which he also was not. He was more complex than that too. And I think, yes, today there is a readiness to rethink Jabotinsky and to see him in a different light than the stereotypical one that has been shown on him in the past. It's no accident, that about 2 years ago, Aleph Bet Yehoshua, the Israeli novelist, who has always been a man of the left, wrote a play, which I must say I didn't see, but wrote a play in 1935, and there are several pages about it in my book. Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion, who had been bitter, bitter rivals, had a series of meetings in London, most of them in a London hotel room, in an attempt to settle their differences, which ultimately didn't succeed, although they came close to success. And Yehoshua, who's always been a man of the left, wrote a play about this Ben-Gurion-Jabotinsky confrontation in London in 1935, which is much more sympathetic in some ways to Jabotinsky than to Ben-Gurion. And it's not an accident, I think. 10 years earlier, that play could not have been written. There is a readiness today. Another example I can give you is that recently the Israeli literary critic Dan Meron, who also teaches at Columbia here in New York, also very much a man politically of the left, has begun writing a series of articles, which I think is now developing into a book on Jabotinsky the writer, Jabotinsky the literary figure, which again would not have happened 10 or 20 years earlier. there is today, I think, a willingness and a readiness and an interest in getting beyond these stereotypes to see Jabotinsky, to try to understand who the man really was, because he is one of the most magnificent figures in 20th century Jewish history. Not one without faults, but one of the most magnificent. And I think today there's an openness to appreciating that and to trying to see exactly where his magnificence lay.
On that note, I think we should thank our author. And our panelists.